So welcome everybody to our new social research seminar series. So we've got a whole series of seminars and workshops going right up until the 2nd of November, where we're going to finish with a panel discussion with speakers from the UK, Sweden, Finland, and I think Denmark as well. So today we're looking at Bayesian Mechanista with Jacob Stegenga. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jaakko, who's going to introduce Jacob.
Thanks, Norma. So Jacob Stegenga is a university lecturer at University of Cambridge, the HBS department, and I'm very, very happy to have him here because I think I really admire Jacob's work because he's not only able to put philosophy and science into a kind of contact with the actual science, but he does so in a way which still maintains the kind of systematic philosophical argument in it. So it's not pure descriptive case studies, but it's also unabashedly prescriptive, and I really like that. Before joining Cambridge, Jacob got his PhD from UC San Diego, and he's worked in Utah, Victoria, and Toronto, globetrotting man. And he's also incredibly productive. He has 2 books out this year. So one book out from OUP, Medical Nihilism, provocatively titled, and also an introduction to philosophy of medicine, Cure and Care, from University of Chicago Press. So that's mind-boggling. So please, Jacob.
Thank you, Jaakko, for that nice introduction, and thanks for the invitation to share my research and for your interest in my research. So the guiding question for the talk today is what kinds of evidence are required for causal inference, and the kinds of inferences that I'm particularly interested in are policy interventions like, will this new drug lower blood pressure? Or will school lunch programs improve student performance? So policy interventions that are supposed to be used in practice. And there are basically 2 broad kinds of answers to this question in the literature. So some people claim that the kind of evidence that we need for these kinds of causal inferences is statistical. The statistical evidence comes from randomized control trials or meta-analyses of randomized control trials. Other people claim that in addition to statistical evidence, we also need mechanistic evidence. So evidence about the causal pathway that links the intervention to the desired outcome. So if you want to know if this drug lowers blood pressure, this mechanistic view says we should know the kind of causal chain from the drug through our physiology to the actual lowering of our blood pressure. So just for reference, I'm referring to those people that hold the view that statistical evidence is all we need as statisticalistas. And those people who hold the view that we need mechanistic evidence, I'm going to call mechanistas. There are pretty persuasive arguments on both sides. I'm going to talk about 2 arguments for each side. So there are 4 arguments that this talk is going to grapple with. And the general thesis of the paper, the punchline, is that our best theory of scientific inference can referee between these 2 views. So our best theory of scientific inference, which today is Bayesian confirmation theory, can explain the 2 arguments, the 2 main arguments on both sides, and ultimately provide some vindication to the Mechanista view. The very, very short version of this thesis is that one of the key principles of Bayesian confirmation theory is that when we're making an inference about some hypothesis, we need to take into account the prior probability of that hypothesis. And part of what ought to inform that prior probability is background knowledge about the mechanism by which the hypothesis is supposed to operate. So just to put this in the context of my overall research program, what I try to do in my research is link two important trends in philosophy of science. So one important trend sometimes goes by the name of philosophy of science in practice. This kind of philosophy of science engages with details of scientific work, often involving case studies and trying to be concerned with not just philosophical concerns, but scientific concerns. So that's one trend, philosophy of science in practice. The other trend is formal philosophy, which is to use tools like probability theory or logic to make sense of problems in science. But on the whole, these trends have developed independently of each other, and one thing that I try to do in my research is fuse these trends. So that's part of what I'm doing here today. Okay, so just to illustrate very briefly these two views, the statisticalista view and the Mechanista view. Statisticalistas think that what happens in mechanisms should just be put into a black box and ignored. So the details of the next two slides they don't really matter, they're just illustrative. So, for example, the statisticalista says, if we want to know if some intervention, like hormone replacement therapy, leads to some particular outcome, like an increase or decrease in mortality, then all we need to do is run an experiment in which we give some subjects intervention, and some subjects some control, and then measure the outcome in the two different groups, and then perform some statistics and compare quantitatively. How the intervention does whatever it does is and should be independent of our inferences. It shouldn't guide or inform our inferences at all. It should just be left as a black box when we're reasoning about the intervention. That's the statisticalista view. The Mechanista view, on the other hand, and again, don't worry about the details of this slide, it's just meant to illustrate the Mechanista view. The Mechanista view says, no, we really need to unpack the causal details that lead from an intervention to an outcome. And we need to take those causal details into account when making our inferences about whether or not the intervention in fact does blah, blah, blah. As many of you know, the so-called evidence-based policy or evidence-based medicine movement has epistemological principles that sometimes get codified or illustrated by what are called evidence hierarchies. So this is a typical evidence hierarchy. Evidence hierarchies rank order kinds of methods according to the extent to which they suffer from particular biases. And these evidence-based policy movements say we should only pay attention to the kinds of evidence at the top of the hierarchy. So typically, randomized trials or meta-analyses of randomized trials are at the top of these evidence hierarchies, and somewhere down at the bottom are expert judgment and mechanistic reasoning. So these evidence hierarchies come along with an epistemological principle which says, just ignore the stuff at the bottom of the hierarchy. When you're making an inference about whether or not some drug does blah, 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 just pay attention to evidence from the top of the hierarchy. Okay, so when answering this question, what kinds of evidence are required to justify causal inferences, there are broadly two camps. Who's in these camps? So these camps include philosophers. So on the statisticalista side, Jeremy Howick and Alex Broadbent are among those who defend the statisticalista view. On the Mechanista side, there are philosophers like Nancy Cartwright, or the so-called Russo and Williamson thesis, or Clark. There are methodologists, so those like medical scientists or economists who make arguments about how we ought to make inferences, like the ones in question. So, for instance, the leaders in the so-called evidence-based medicine movement explicitly defend the statisticalista view. On the other hand, famously, the epidemiologist Sir Bradford Hill articulated what he called, or what came to be called, the Hill criteria, which were a set of principles that were supposed to inform causal inferences in epidemiology. And part of those principles, like explicitly stated Mechanista ideas. And it's not just philosophers or scientists in these movements like evidence-based medicine or epidemiology, it's also policymakers. So The Food and Drug Administration in the United States and the European Medicines Agency explicitly articulate statisticalista views in their regulations. So in the United States, if you want to get a new drug approved, the main requirement now is a randomized control trial which shows that your drug is superior to placebo. That's, you in fact need 2 of these typically, 2 positive randomized control trials in order to get your drug approved. So it's an explicit codification of the statisticalista view. And the EMA policy on new drug regulation is similar to the FDA. On the other hand, other policymakers like IARC, which is this international agency which assesses the extent to which particular chemicals are cancer-causing, or the risk of them being cancer-causing. IARC employs Mechanista principles in its set of, in the evidence that it appeals to. Okay, so these 2 camps are pretty well articulated and polarized. Now, what exactly the positions amount to are up for grabs in the literature. So sometimes the positions are described and defended in slightly vague terms. So for example, perhaps the most famous philosophical articulation of the Mechanist view is by the philosophers Rousseau and Williamson. They write, if there is no plausible mechanism from C to E, from the intervention to the outcome, then any correlation, like any evidence you find in the statistical, like the statistical kind of evidence, is likely to be spurious. So they seem to be making a really strong claim about what the Mechanist view entails. They're saying, if there's no plausible mechanism, then probably the statistical evidence is misleading. But in other places, they say things that contradict that. And I'll mention this if I have time later. So articulating exactly what the Mechanist view is, if you're just going by what the main proponents in the literature say, can be a little bit confusing. For purposes of this paper, the Mechanist view holds that in order to make an inference from intervention to outcome, in order to make the kinds of causal inferences in question, mechanistic evidence is necessary. The statisticalistas deny that. So they say we can make the kinds of causal inferences in question without mechanistic evidence, and moreover, mechanistic evidence is typically unreliable. So we should, even if we have some mechanistic evidence available, we shouldn't pay attention to it because it's typically unreliable. Okay, there are, as I noted at the start, 4 key arguments in the literature, 2 for each side. So in the next few minutes, I'm just going to describe these 4 arguments. So the basic structure of the talk is I'm going to, in a kind of narrative form, describe those 4 arguments. And then I'm going to turn to the kind of formal accounting of the arguments and argue that the arguments apply in particular circumstances. So I'm going to resolve the kind of apparent tension between the 4 arguments. The first argument I'm just calling the evidence-based argument. The evidence-based argument is simple. It says, if you want to know if some intervention does blah, 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 then you should just pay attention to the best evidence that you've got available. And that tends to be statistical evidence from randomized control trials or meta-analyses. If you don't guide your inference by that kind of evidence, you're not being a good empiricist. So a famous example of this, and one that gets used in the pertinent literature, is that of James Lind, who was a physician in the Scottish Navy. He was trying to find an intervention for scurvy. Many soldiers were dying of scurvy. And he ran a little experiment. And sometimes Lind's experiment is described as the first medical trial. So he took some sailors with scurvy, gave some of them citrus juice, some of them seawater, some of them vinegar, and some of them nothing. And those sailors that got citrus juice, their symptoms of scurvy were alleviated very quickly, and the other sailors still had scurvy. So the idea is Lind ran this simple trial, got some statistical evidence, and from that evidence inferred that citrus fruit was a good intervention for treating scurvy. And so at the time, we should have made the inference that in fact citrus fruit was a good intervention for scurvy. Now, of course, there's all sorts of like modern examples of this. So for instance, suppose you want to know like how effective are antidepressants for treating depression. Arguably, what you should do is pay attention to those meta-analyses that get access to all of the data from randomized control trials, both published and unpublished. And there are a few out there. So suppose, and in fact this is the case, that such a meta-analysis shows that on a 50-point scale, antidepressants lower symptoms of depression by 1.8 points. The evidence-based argument says when you want to make an estimate of how effective antidepressants are, your estimation of the effectiveness should be heavily guided by that meta-analysis. Like if your estimation departs significantly from 1.8 points on this 50-point scale, you're not being a good empiricist. Like, ask yourself, what would you think that the effectiveness of antidepressants is once you learn about the results of this meta-analysis? 10 points, 0 points, any significant departure from 1.8 points is violating like prescriptions of empiricism. You should pay attention to your best evidence. That's the evidence-based argument. So it's one of the key arguments for the statisticalist view. The second main argument for the statisticalist view involves appealing to the unreliability of our mechanistic knowledge. So because statisticalistas say that we should just leave mechanistic knowledge in a black box, I call this the trouble in the box argument. I had a hard time like coming up with names for these arguments, so they're not very, like aesthetically pleasing names of arguments. But anyways, this is the trouble in the box argument for the statisticalista. It's a trope in the evidence-based medicine literature. So it's really common to hear a lecture from somebody in the evidence-based medicine community. They'll say something like, for decades and decades, we were employing such and such intervention. And then we ran a randomized control trial, and we found that that intervention either wasn't doing anything or was hurting people or killing people. So for all these years, we were like not doing any good and probably doing more harm than good. And the randomized control trial came to the rescue. And the reason why we were using those interventions before the randomized control trial was because mechanistic reasoning told us to. So one example from the kind of long history of medicine is based on Galenic humoral theory. So diseases for many centuries were conceived of and defined as being caused by an imbalance in Galenic humors. So for example, psychosis was thought to be an imbalance in having too much blood. And so the intervention that was called for was bloodletting. And of course, bloodletting was an intervention for many diseases. Now the idea is like, well, the pathophysiological basis of those diseases was conceived of according to faulty mechanistic reasoning, which spuriously warranted interventions that we now know are useless and very likely harmful. And so that's like an example of the way in which mechanistic reasoning can go awry. Another argument for this, another way in which this trouble in the box argument gets off the ground is by describing or noting the impressive complexity of mechanisms of disease physiology that we now know today. So for example, this is a causal graph of the pathophysiological basis of depression. It's too small for you to see, so I'll just zoom in a bit. And so this is given to us by some of the leading research psychiatrists of today, and it's supposed to describe the causal basis of depression. And you can see that the nodes in this causal graph are themselves really complicated social phenomena, like whether or not you've ever had lifetime trauma, or do you have low self-esteem or low parental warmth. Just in case you can't see it, I'll zoom in once more. And so this causal graph is extremely complicated. Right? And so the statisticalistas say making inferences about interventions is really risky because the mechanisms at play are extremely complicated. They're complicated for reasons having to do with, say, evolutionary history, or reasons having to do with the complexity of human behavior. And so we ought not appeal to mechanistic evidence, even if we have a little bit of mechanistic knowledge to appeal to, because it's very likely misleading. That's the trouble in the box argument for the statisticalista. Okay, I'm going to turn to the two key arguments for the Mechanista. There's a kind of joke in the literature, which goes as follows. We wouldn't run a statistical trial, like a randomized control trial, testing the effectiveness of parachutes to slow our fall, right? We wouldn't take some subjects and give them parachutes and some subjects and give them no parachutes and have them jump out of a plane, right? Now, it's kind of funny, but one reason why there's that hypothetical, that thought experiment is persuasive is that we know exactly how parachutes are designed, right? So we know how they work. And so because we know how they work, we know that they work. And so I'm going to call this the know-how argument for the Mechanista. So we can appeal to basic physical principles and the mechanism that was built into the design of the parachutes to make an inference that the parachute is going to slow our fall. Now, of course, one doesn't need these kinds of like fanciful examples. So here's a kind of complicated biochemical cartoon that one sees in medical textbooks. The details don't matter too much, but it's a different kind of illustration of the know-how argument. So this class of drugs, PPAR modulators, what they do is they bind to a particular component of cells, and those that component of cells, PPAR activators, they turn on and off many different kinds of genes. So this one component of a cell influences many different aspects of our physiology because they turn up and down many different kinds of genes. So if our hypothesis was like relatively coarse-grained, like this class of drugs will have many physiological effects in our body, there's a hypothesis. We can reason just from our mechanistic knowledge that that hypothesis should be like pretty well confirmed. We don't need to run a randomized control trial in order to warrant that kind of hypothesis. We can appeal to our mechanistic knowledge. This know-how argument doesn't always have to be in favor of confirming a causal hypothesis of interest. The know-how argument can also serve to cause doubts about causal hypotheses. So here's another funny example. There was a randomized trial which was performed about 15 years ago, which tested the effects of retroactive intercessory prayer on patient outcome. So some subjects were allocated to the intervention group, some subjects to a control group. The subjects were patients in a clinic who had been in a clinic something like 5 years prior to the experiment. The subjects that were in the intervention group were prayed for by some people in a church. And then the researchers calculated various outcome measures and found that the patients that were prayed for had slightly better patient outcomes than the patients that received no prayer. Okay? Now, it was a spoof article, but it was published in one of our best medical journals. The idea is none of us are willing to think that retroactive intercessory prayer is effective. And that's because in order for it to be effective, it would have to violate known, really well-established physical laws and mechanisms. Right? So based on everything we know about the world, retroactive intercessory prayer just can't be effective. Right? So the know-how argument here serves to disconfirm the causal hypothesis of interest. Okay, so that's the first kind of key argument for the Mechanista view is the know-how argument. The second, I'm calling trouble in the data argument. So as Jaakko mentioned, here's just one moment of shameless self-promotion. So I just finished publishing a book, and in a big part of this book was dedicated to arguing that the main statistical methods in clinical research, like the randomized control trial and meta-analysis, are malleable. They can be bent to get the results that a researcher wants. And there are many different ways in which these methods can be bent. So these methods are shot through with biases. The trouble in the data argument says, because of those biases, we shouldn't rely on statistical evidence. We know that the statistical evidence from randomized control trials and meta-analysis is biased. So there are many different ways, as I noted, there are many different ways in which such biases occur. I'll describe a few. One is how subjects are recruited to trials in the first place. There are various exclusion and inclusion criteria for subjects in trials. Some of them are epistemologically benign, like we want subjects of a certain age, sometimes of a certain gender. We want subjects to not have too many other diseases or not be on too many other drugs. Sometimes these exclusion criteria are defended on ethical grounds, like we don't want pregnant women in trials on new experimental drugs because we have experience that sometimes experimental drugs harm babies. But other times these inclusion and exclusion criteria are epistemologically suspect. So there's a very, very common method in trials called run-in periods. So in a run-in period, what the researchers do is, first they recruit subjects to a trial. They randomly allocate some subjects to the intervention group and some subjects to the placebo group. And then they have a kind of preliminary phase in the trial in which those subjects in the placebo group get placebo, those subjects in the intervention group get the experimental drug, and the researchers have a kind of coarse-grained look to see how the patients are doing. And those patients who are very placebo responsive, like who do really well on placebo, are excluded from the remainder of the trial, like the part of the trial in which hard data is collected. And those subjects in the intervention group who do very poorly on the intervention are excluded from the remainder of the trial. So this is, it doesn't take too much thinking through to see that that systematically stacks the deck in favor of the intervention under investigation. Right? And these are widely employed research tactics that are supported by regulators like the FDA and the EMA. Another kind of aspect of medical research and social policy research that many of you are familiar with is publication bias. So publication bias is the publishing of results that are favorable to your hypotheses of interest and withholding of results that are unfavorable to your hypothesis of interest. So if you just go to the published record and have a look at the evidence that's available for some causal hypothesis, we know, based on the phenomenon of publication bias, that the published evidence will systematically be stacked in favor of causal hypotheses and against the disconfirmation of causal hypotheses. So the Mechanista says this statistical evidence is highly unreliable. And again, that retroactive intercessory prayer example, this kind of comic example, should give us pause when we're thinking about how reliable published trials are. This was like a randomized control trial published in one of the world's most important medical journals, and therefore we should think that not all published trials in leading medical journals are reliable. On the other hand, sometimes evidence from experiments which is completely shot through with biases can nevertheless be really persuasive. So here's an example that I really like. This is Banting and Best in Toronto, who discovered the pathophysiological basis of type 1 diabetes and that insulin could modulate that pathophysiological basis. When they finally found in their dog model that exogenous insulin could relieve symptoms of type 1 diabetes, they just walked across the street to a pediatric ward. At the time, the therapy for diabetes was starvation therapy. So children who were born with type 1 diabetes would live until they were about 15 or 16 years old, emaciated, and then they would die. They would fall into a coma for a few years and then die. So there were these wards full of comatose 12-year-olds. And Banting and Best just walked across the street and just started jabbing kids with exogenous insulin, and the kids just literally just woke up out of their comas. So it wasn't a blinded experiment, it wasn't a controlled experiment, it wasn't a randomized experiment, there was no meta-analysis. It was shot through with confirmation bias, maybe placebo effects, who knows. It didn't have any of the controls that modern experiments have, but the evidence was extremely striking. So this is going to be important in just a minute. Okay, so to wrap up this part of the talk, there are 4 key arguments at play. 2 for the statisticalistas. That was the evidence-based argument and the trouble in the box argument. And 2 for the mechanistas, the know-how argument and the trouble in the data argument. Okay, what I want to do just in the next few minutes is try to make sense of the extent to which these 4 arguments are in fact persuasive. So what should we make of these 4 arguments? What should we believe? Should we believe the statisticalista or should we believe the mechanista? And in order to do this, I want to draw on a kind of general prescriptive theory of scientific inference. So note that the statisticalista and the mechanista are trying to sell us like very local principles of inference. They're saying, if you want to make such and such inference in such and such context, you should appeal to such and such evidence. And my thinking is, we can assess these local principles of inference by appealing to a more general and prescriptive theory of inference. Okay, and that is Bayesian confirmation theory. So briefly, if we have some hypothesis like this drug does blah, 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 and we have some evidence which is the statistical evidence about H. I'm just modeling the scenario this way. So E in this setup is the statistical evidence about H. Then the conditional probability P of H given E represents our confidence in H, the probability that this drug in fact does blah, 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 now that we've got this statistical evidence. And given Bayes' theorem, that's equivalent to the term on the right-hand side of the equation. This term is called the likelihood, which represents the impact of the statistical evidence. This term is the prior, which represents our background knowledge prior to getting any evidence, statistical evidence. And this term is called the expectancy, which is a measure of the reliability of the method that generated the evidence. And this term is called the posterior, which is a kind of overall measure of the confirmation of our hypothesis now that we've got the evidence. Okay. With that tool in hand, we can assess the plausibility of these 4 arguments and articulate formal conditions under which the 4 arguments are in fact persuasive. So we'll start with the evidence-based argument. Okay, so the evidence-based argument, recall, it holds that if you want to assess whether or not drug D does blah, 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 you should just pay attention to the statistical evidence, the best evidence that we've got, the statistical evidence about whether or not drug D does blah, blah, blah. The statistical evidence is represented by this term. Now, when does this apply? Well, recall the retroactive intercessory prayer example. So that example was meant to show that in certain circumstances, your inference shouldn't be swayed by statistical evidence. Well, what circumstances? Circumstances in which this term is either very high or very low. So if that term is very low, like in the retroactive intercessory prayer case, like all of us should have an extremely low prior that retroactive intercessory prayer is effective. Like maybe not 0 because we're epistemically modest, but 0.00001, say, right? So if this is extremely low, then no amount of confirming statistical evidence can get this term, which represents our final confidence, very high, right? So I'm going to call that extremal. If this term is extremal, like extremely low or extremely high, then the evidence-based argument doesn't apply. If this term is middling, namely not extremal, say 0.5, 0.4, 0.7, something like that, then our final term that represents the confidence in H can be swayed by statistical evidence. So imagine, for instance, here's a hypothesis. The average age of people in this room is greater than 2 years old. Okay? Do we need to ask a sociologist to run a survey in which we ask all of our birthdays, and then we calculate the mean of our age and standard deviation in order to assess that hypothesis? No, we don't need to do that, right? Why? Because our prior in that age is extremely high, like 0.9999999, right? No sociological survey is going to sway us. We're happy to make the inference without any kind of population level evidence. So that's a situation in which the prior is extremely high. The retroactive intercessory prayer case is a situation in which the prior is extremely low. In those situations, the evidence-based argument does not apply. But if the prior is middling, somewhere in the middle, then the evidence-based argument can apply. Another illustration of this is that Banting and Best case. So Banting and Best, when they walked over and jabbed kids in the coma ward, the evidence was just so striking. So this term represents the impact of population level evidence. And the prior, yeah, I'm sure at the time their prior was relatively high, but because they'd already done the experiment on dogs, but it wasn't extremely high. That was the point of doing the experiment. So their final confirmation was really swayed by the statistical evidence. So it's a situation in which the evidence-based argument did in fact apply. Okay, what about the trouble in the box argument? The trouble in the box argument kind of fits hand in hand with the evidence-based argument. The trouble in the box argument says, look, we have all of these historical examples in which appealing to mechanistic evidence led us astray. And so we shouldn't do that now. We shouldn't appeal to mechanistic evidence now. In other words, when we ask, what's our prior in H? The trouble in the box argument says it should usually be middling, because you shouldn't be appealing to background knowledge or mechanistic knowledge or theoretical knowledge to sway your prior far from middling values. So insofar as a premise of the evidence-based argument was that the prior is middling, the evidence-based argument, trouble in the box argument works hand in hand in saying typically our prior ought to be middling. Okay. What's interesting about the two arguments for the Mechanista compared to the two arguments for the Statisticalista is that they're exactly converse. So the know-how argument, recall, was illustrated by the parachute. Yeah? So the know-how argument says, we know how the parachute works, therefore we know that the parachute works. So the know-how argument says, look, in some context at least, we have good mechanistic or theoretical reasons to have extremal priors. extremely high or extremely low. So the parachute case is a situation in which if our hypothesis is this intervention will slow our fall when we jump out of an airplane, then our prior ought to be extremely high based on mechanistic reasoning. If the hypothesis is retroactive intercessory prayer will make you feel better when you're in a clinic, then your prior ought to be extremely low, and that's by appealing to mechanistic knowledge. So the know-how argument says, look, there are at least some cases in which the prior should be extremal on mechanistic grounds. The trouble in the data argument says, again, statistical evidence is often unreliable. Okay, for reasons that I won't go into, this term represents the reliability of methods that generate statistical evidence. If those methods are unreliable, if they're biased, then this term is relatively high. You can get a feel for this intuitively. So imagine you read in the newspaper the results of some recent meta-analysis that says, I don't know, antidepressants make you feel better. But you know that that literature is shot through with systematic biases. And you ask yourself, well, what's the probability that I would read results like this in, say, The Guardian, regardless of the truth of the hypothesis, regardless of whether or not the antidepressants in fact make me feel better? Well, given everything you know about the biases that are systematically ubiquitous in the literature, your answer is pretty high. Like, it's very probable that you're going to end up coming across evidence like this regardless of the truth of the hypothesis. So that term is pretty high. And since it's in the denominator of Bayes' theorem, that has a lowering impact on the final confidence term. Yeah? So and this is kind of intuitive, if the methods are unreliable, if the methods that generate the statistical evidence is unreliable, then that statistical evidence should have little impact on your final degree of confirmation. And if that's the case, if it's the case that statistical evidence doesn't sway our assessment of the causal hypothesis much, then that leaves space for the prior to sway our confidence in the hypothesis. Right? And again, what influences our prior? Mechanistic knowledge. So that's why that's an argument for the Mechanista. I want to go back very briefly and note one thing about these two arguments for the Statisticalista. Recall that one of the conditions for application of the evidence-based argument is that the prior has to be middling. So how do we know whether or not the prior is middling or extremal? Well, we appeal to background mechanistic knowledge and background theory, right? So if you want to know, like for instance, when we made an assessment of the retroactive intercessory prayer case, we were appealing to background theory or background knowledge of mechanisms to assess the extremal value of the prior. Same with the parachute case. Same with the Banting and Best diabetes case. So in order to know whether or not this argument applies, we're already in the business of reasoning mechanistically. So what was supposed to be an argument for the Statisticalista, what was supposed to be an argument that said we can reason about these hypotheses just by appealing to statistical evidence. It turns out that that argument, we only know if the argument applies if we're already in the business of reasoning mechanistically. So that takes a lot of sting out of the argument for the Statisticalista. Okay. I think I'm probably close to running out of time. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So there are various nuances that I won't dwell on here. But if we have time in the Q&A, we can. One just kind of funny thing that I mean I find funny about this literature is the role of historical examples in the literature. So I've already made gesture to a few of these historical examples. The examples like the retroactive intercessory prayer or the Lind case are widespread in the literature. So this is from Semmelweis's discovery that hand washing could lower the rates of childbed fever. What's interesting is that both the Statisticalistas and the Mechanistas appeal to the very same historical cases to make their points. And so I call this the underdetermination of philosophical, oh, sorry, I've skipped this already. I call this the underdetermination of philosophical theory by historical example. It's something that I find sort of entertaining in the literature. Okay, there are a couple of worries that one might have, but I'll leave these for the commentary and Q&A, and just quickly wrap up here. So again, the guiding question is, what kinds of evidence are required to justify causal inferences in these very practical domains like medicine and social policy? We saw that there are two main answers, the statisticalista view and the Mechanista view, and our best general theory of scientific inference can explain the arguments on both sides. To a certain degree, it shows that, well, it depends on contextual details, but in general, appealing to this general principle of scientific inference provides some vindication for a modest Mechanista view. That's all. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jacob. I propose we have two commentaries now, brief commentaries, and then you can respond, and then we'll open the discussion. And first we have two commentaries. We have Professor Noora Teikin and then Dr. Samuli Reila. And my idea was that Professor Teikin has a more kind of practitioner point of view. She has been very much involved in actually running social interventions in terms of cultural musical interventions on well-being and so on and so forth, and also an evaluation of those. So let's start with Noora's comments.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to say thank you for a fascinating talk and extremely well presented. And I read the paper as well that you sent around earlier, and I'd recommend, if you haven't read it, everyone, really, it's definitely rewarding. I don't think I've got anything really to add to what you said. I think it's just so well explained. I just wanted to raise some things from my experience, really, that where we could think about where this goes in kind of practice and what are the kind of implementation issues that surround it. I work in an area where, typically there are very complex interventions like arts and health and well-being, where there's very little history of research, where randomized trials and statistical evidence are very difficult to procure. They're also very expensive, and there isn't a long history of research where we could establish a kind of proper sense of a prior, in your term. So it's kind of a very exploratory and also quite a creative kind of field in more ways than one. And I just wondered, and this may be my sort of poor understanding of what you've said, but whether there's a case for looking at these not so much as an either-or kind of situation, which I'm sure it is in some instances if you're looking at how do you judge a drug, a new intervention like a drug or something like that. But more generally in terms of the development of a field and the development of knowledge, is there a case that these two different approaches go serially or in a kind of circular motion? So I was thinking about the lemons and the scurvy, and supposing they had no lemons available, but they'd already found the effect, their knowledge of the mechanisms would have guided them to maybe a different solution, so you could find the citrus element from some other kind of sources if it's available. So without kind of mechanistic thinking, we're not really able to form hypotheses. And so it makes me think then that the statistical work, which is really important, really should be in the service of a broader kind of ontological kind of approach, which is guided by mechanistic evidence, which is always imperfect. So, maybe the best strategies that we have as scientists and policymakers, etc., is to try and just improve both aspects as much as we possibly can, rather than thinking that it's going to be one or the other. But the other thing that I thought of as you were talking, and especially about the prayer example, in this kind of post-truth kind of world that we're moving into, I think there are more and more people who would actually probably believe the evidence in that instance. And so what do we do about this kind of non-rational kind of thinking? And how do we improve policy making so it can be more kind of guided by philosophy and etc. So those are really my kind of thoughts and responses. And I suppose my other response is that the whole process in reality is a lot more creative and messy and also subjective. And there is an element of subjective thinking in the kind of the model that you've proposed. And so that would be something that I would see as a potential thing to kind of think about and maybe open up the possibility that this is actually more creative, more fictitious, more exploratory than we would all like it to be. So those are my sort of comments. And thank you very much.
Should I respond now? Or okay, yeah. So, this one. Yeah, thanks so much for those comments. I agree with all of them, and they're very insightful. So maybe I'll take one of the latter ones first. So on the role of subjectivity. Yeah, so one of the standard things that one says about this Bayesian approach to thinking about science is that the terms in the formalism are subjective, and some people take that as a criticism of the Bayesian approach, and Bayesians sometimes respond by saying, well, first of all, it's not completely subjective because a lot of the terms are guided by, background theory, and so it's subjective to a certain degree, but it's still constrained by, facts. But insofar as it's subjective, that's a faithful representation of real science. And so, yeah, I think that's important. But it does raise this worry that you raised immediately prior to that, namely, what about the fact that, we're in this post-truth era, and if we just allow subjectivity in assessing science in general or scientific questions in this particular domain, then where does that leave us? And some of my arguments seem to be trying to pump your intuition about particular cases, like the retroactive intercessory repair case. But if you don't share that intuition, then the argument's not going to be very persuasive. I guess what I have to say to that is, yeah, it is a prescriptive argument. So when I argue that we ought to be taking into account mechanistic evidence like the theoretical implausibility of retroactive intercessory prayer, that's a prescriptive argument that's warranted by the Bayesian approach, and the case is meant to be kind of illustrative, but it's illustrative only insofar as you share my intuition, I guess, about it. Yeah. And then another thing that you raised, which is really important, is so in a sense this paper is in the realm of the ideal, and I'm saying, yeah, we should be paying attention to both statistical evidence and mechanistic evidence, but then there's this really applied question about, well, how should we do that, especially in context in which either there's not a very well-developed statistical body of evidence, or there's not a very well-developed theoretical or mechanistic body of evidence, and that's an important question. There are some people, for instance, there's this so-called EBM Plus group based in London, who are arguing that we should be taking into account mechanistic evidence, and they're offering kind of practical handbooky type suggestions on how to do that. And so there are some people who are giving an account of how to assess the quality of mechanistic evidence. In the evidence-based policy and evidence-based medicine movement, as we saw, say, with the evidence hierarchy, there are many proposals on how to assess the quality of statistical evidence. But so far, there haven't been much work done on how to assess the quality of mechanistic evidence. So there's a little bit of work done by this EBM Plus group. But yeah, thanks a lot for your comments. Yeah.
Okay. And do you want to introduce our next commentator? And I think...
Yeah, sure. I forgot to use these. So for next we have Dr. Saul Reula, a project researcher here at Tampere, a philosopher, also published recently on mechanistic reasoning in policy use. So Samui.
Thank you. Okay, I have a few slides. Let's see if it works. It's all black. Let's see if we mirror. Does that work? No. Here. All right. Let's go back to the beginning. I have a few slides. It won't take that long. Okay, so here are my comments. First of all, I found it very interesting. It was a very interesting paper, and like you point out in the paper and also in the talk, it's a policy relevant issue. So in that sense, it's a somewhat rare kind of philosophical discussion that there are actually practitioners who engage in sort of talking about the same issues that we address here as philosophers. So I think this is that's one of the reasons why it's a very important paper. And what I would like to talk about is how you kind of get the whole thing going, how you set up your Bayesian machinery. Because I think one of the fundamental disagreements between philosophers in particular on this topic has to do with how you define statistical and mechanistic evidence. So I'm with you in your analysis of how it goes once you set up the Bayesian machinery, but my questions and comments have to do with how you do that setting up mostly. So in the recent discussions, many philosophers have pointed out that it's very difficult to draw the distinction between statistical and mechanistic evidence. It's kind of it's intuitive in a way. You think you know how that distinction should be drawn, but many people have now pointed out that actually it's not the distinction that's about methods, because both statistical and mechanistic evidence can be produced by kind of a set of kind of overlapping methods. So it's not purely a methods distinction, nor is it purely a population level versus individual level distinction. So that doesn't line up either. Of course, they're correlated, but it's not. You cannot define the statistical versus mechanistic distinction in these terms. So, as far as I understood it, this is how you define your terms here. So you say that mechanistic evidence is something that you get from mechanistic reasoning. And I guess this comes from like Howick style way to set it up. Whereas mechanistic reasoning, in turn, involves inferring from knowledge of underlying causal mechanisms between D and X. D was your intervention and X is your causal effect, to the claim that D does X. And then you have this sort of Bayesian reconstruction of these ideas, which is just presented. So your hypothesis, H, you express it as sort of D does X, right? Yeah. And then the evidence that goes into the Bayes formula, that's the population level statistical evidence relevant to the hypothesis. And like you said, mechanistic evidence, like it comes into the picture through the prior. So maybe my sort of main concern, or my main question has to do, it's a theme introduced by Nancy Cartwright, which I'm sure you're well aware of, is that, well, when you say that D brings about X, there's a further issue of sort of where does that bringing about happen? Is it in if you're running if you're interested in social policy, is that about your target site, the place where you want to apply your policy? That would be one claim, right? Another one could be it brings about this effect everywhere. Or it could be about your experimental population. So there's the question of sort of where does that causal link between your intervention and your effect obtained. And I think my comments kind of, or they're not so much about evidence-based medicine, but more about evidence-based policy, because that's where you often get this sort of worry about an intervention working in, say, one country and not working in another one. And the way I would like to sort of approach my main question is to provide what I think is the strongest argument for the Mechanistas. And that has to do with extrapolation. You mentioned this in the paper. Now you didn't talk about it, but I think for the sort of weak Mechanista thesis, that mechanistic evidence is necessary for justifying, say, social policy interventions. That's the place where you can, I think, a strongest claim for the Mechanista position can be made. Whereas for the internal validity, so if you're just talking about that one experimental population, say you're running an experiment in a particular country, and the experiment statistical data tells you something about the effect size. I haven't really seen any convincing argument why, for that, establishing that internal validity, you would need mechanistic evidence. Maybe you need better statistical evidence, like this is probably something you talk about in the book. So you might need more statistical data, or you might need more rigorous methods for collecting that data. But I don't see how that in itself is an argument for requiring mechanistic evidence. However, when you want to transport inferences about that population into another one, that's where the Mechanista camp has a stronger claim. And this idea has been expressed perhaps most clearly by Nancy Cartwright. Basically, she puts it in this way. So that statistical evidence tells you that your intervention worked there, somewhere where you ran your experiment, but it does not guarantee that it will work here in your application site, what you actually care about. And why? Well, of course, experiments depend on lots of kind of modulating factors or supporting factors, as Cartwright calls them. So many things have to be in place for an intervention to be successful. And I guess here one of the paradigm cases is with the Tamil Nadu nutrition program. So you run a successful experiment in India, in Tamil Nadu, where you educate mothers about nutrition for their children, and then you use that evidence to justify another experiment or an intervention in Bangladesh. It doesn't work. Well, why does it not work? Well, it didn't work because there was a crucial difference in, you could call, supporting factor. In Bangladesh, it's not the mother who's responsible for buying food for the children. I guess that's roughly how it goes. So you would need to know about these sort of contextual factors in order to extrapolate your findings from statistical trials. And well, how does mechanistic evidence then, how does it help you in this kind of inductive, risky inductive inference? Well, it might tell you that the mechanism you discovered, if you know about the properties of that mechanism, you might also know that well, it's robust. You find it pretty much everywhere. Say that if your experiment relies on a sort of psychological bias that all of us share, then you might know that, well, if that's the mechanism, I can be quite confident in extrapolating this policy to another domain or other population. Or you might know about the actual causal mechanisms both in your experimental site, and then you might have information about your application site. And by saying that, look, the same thing functions in both of these populations, hence I'm justified in applying this intervention from my experimental population to my target population. So that might be another sense in which you use mechanistic evidence. Or, yeah, and that was actually already number 3. So I'm just trying to say that there are these different senses in which you can make use of mechanistic evidence in justifying interventions. And I guess what your proposal is that well, all of that just goes into the prior in this Bayesian way of formulating the issue. But I guess my question is that, well, do you think that it really captures the sort of kind of reasoning and sort of argumentative dynamic that operates in these cases 2 and 3? Just kind of throwing everything into the prior. So I'm not arguing against your conclusions in the example, but kind of more about sort of how you set it up, and would people who have talked about these things, especially in the philosophical literature, would they accept your framing of the issue? Then one question is that, well, you say that mechanistic evidence goes into our priors, but doesn't also sort of prior statistical evidence or statistical evidence from other populations that you've studied that generalizes to this one, doesn't that also go into the prior? So I guess you don't want to in any way define mechanistic evidence by saying that, well, that's the kind of background evidence that goes into the prior. So that would be a far stronger claim. And I guess, yeah, my intuition would be that, well, one way to bring these different senses of mechanistic evidence into your analysis would be to make the hypothesis more precise, the with H. So basically, like I mentioned in the beginning, saying that D does X is a bit ambiguous between whether you want to say that D always does X, it's a kind of some kind of a law that it always happens, or whether you're saying that, well, D will do X here in my actual application site. But then I guess my question would be like, if you try to make the hypothesis more precise in that way, that you kind of index it to a particular population, how would the Bayesian machinery work in that case? And then finally, like, just thinking of, like, if you brought more structure, maybe you could also mention what you would do with conflicting evidence, because if you have a very low prior, very high likelihood, both are extreme, neither one is middling, what do you do in such a case? So now that you mentioned that one case where you had a very high prior in a hypothesis, and you said that, well, then you shouldn't go collecting more experimental data. I was thinking about the peptic ulcer example, for example. So for a long time, there was a consensus that the peptic ulcer disease was caused by acidity in the stomach. And people didn't run that many experiments because everybody agreed. Everybody had a high prior that that's the case, indeed the case. Until it turned out, I guess it was in the 1980s, that it turned out that it was caused by bacteria. There was an alternative hypothesis, which was the correct one. But since we didn't collect that evidence, we were wrong for a long time. So I guess the fact that you have a high prior or low prior in something doesn't have normative implications, like you said, on whether we should be collecting evidence for a particular intervention or a hypothesis. Right. So I had three questions. So first, I brought up the issue of extrapolation, which I think might be the strongest case you could make for the Mechanista position. Then another question has to do with the sort of statistical versus mechanistic distinction. Can you capture that in terms of likelihood and prior in the sort of Bayesian way? And then finally, what should we do when we have the mechanistic and statistical evidence in conflict? Thank you.
Okay, should I take a brief moment? So there was a lot there. Thank you so much for these comments. And I pretty much agree with most of what you said. I disagree with a few small details, but very briefly, it's true that in the literature, the distinction between what statistical evidence is and what mechanistic evidence is really muddy and kind of frustrating. The main articulation of the distinction is by Russo and Williamson, and I think that they get it wrong. I guess this video is being live streamed and maybe they're watching, so sorry guys. But what they say is, and they appeal to an argument that you made, that the methods that generate these different kinds of evidence can often overlap. So here's what they say. You can get mechanistic evidence evidence that so the requirement is that you have evidence that there's a mechanism, not that you need mechanistic evidence. But you can have evidence that there's a mechanism from statistical evidence. So if you have a randomized control trial that gives you some evidence that D does X, but well, that implies that you have at least some evidence for a mechanism that D does X. So my view is that it's scientifically inert, right? So it doesn't tell methodologists or regulators or scientists anything about whether or not they in fact need mechanistic evidence, right? But it's also not faithful to the conclusion of their arguments, because their arguments, in my view, in fact, entail that something more than just statistical evidence is required for the kinds of causal inferences in question. So in my view, the Mechanistic requirement is that we need mechanistic evidence, where what that means is reasoning from background knowledge of mechanisms. And typically that comes from, say, bench science or like drawing out the biochemical details that link some intervention to some outcome. Completely different kind of mechanism from a randomized control trial or meta-analysis. And I completely agree with you that one of the persuasive arguments for the Mechanista is this Cartwright extrapolation worry, and it's not one that I mentioned in the talk. I don't think it's the only argument for the Mechanista view, but it is a strong argument for the Mechanista view. We might find that D does X in this, well, we might find evidence that D does X in this controlled experiment, but what we want to know is, will D do X in this target population? And in order to make that inference, Cartwright argues that we need to appeal to mechanisms. One thing that you noted is that you're persuaded by the statisticalist view when it comes to assessing internal validity. So if we have a perfectly controlled, perfectly done randomized control trial, so the internal validity is extremely high, you're claiming that the statisticalist view is persuasive. I'm not persuaded. So there's a distinction between whether or not there's high internal validity of a method and whether or not we ought to affirm the hypothesis in question, right? So imagine a scenario like the retroactive intercessory prayer case, in which we have a perfectly controlled experiment that gives some statistical evidence for a hypothesis, which is extremely implausible, right? The question that the Mechanista is posing is, well, should we believe in H, right? They're not saying, is the internal validity of your method high, right? Because you can have high internal validity of a method, which gives statistical evidence for a hypothesis which is implausible, right? Implausible on mechanistic grounds. And so I agree with you that the statisticalist has a case to be made that the RCT has high internal validity. I'm completely on board with that. And there are technical proofs in the literature that show that if you perform an ideal RCT, that entails that you can infer a causal, you can make a causal inference, at least for the experimental context. One way to articulate the Mechanista position is, but no real RCT is an ideal RCT, and we know that based on mechanistic reasoning. Then you raise this interesting question at the end about what about conflicting evidence? Like, what if we have statistical evidence that suggests that D does X, but mechanistic evidence in which D doesn't do X? And I think a kind of a comic example is this retroactive intercessory prayer case. But in my view, in fact, a lot of medicine and social policy is constituted by situations in which we have pretty weak statistical evidence for some hypothesis and pretty modest mechanistic evidence against that hypothesis. I think a good example of this is antidepressants. Right? So there's very, very weak statistical evidence that antidepressants have some small effect on depression. I think there's modest mechanistic and theoretical reasons to think that that's implausible. And so what should we but those are cases in which the two different kinds of evidence are both like sort of modest signals, right? They're not cases in which there's strong signals, one going in one direction, one going in the other direction. But in any case, thanks a lot for your comments. Yeah.
Okay, many thanks to the commentators, and please, I'll open the floor for questions. Great. So Risto and then Rebecca.
Okay, thank you for a very inspiring and brilliant talk. I'll ask a very foolish question, probably, but or maybe too loaded question. I happened to read the newspaper this morning, and there's talking about evidence-based policy. There's this meeting going on in South Korea where climate scientists have gathered, and now they're talking about the obvious, of course. What happens in a situation to this thinking when we run into sort of complex, probabilistic problems about the future?
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to hear you saying, which I kind of like, is the idea that since we have a sense of the mechanistics, and there's a simple explanation of why climate change and carbon emissions are linked, so D does X or whatever.
Yeah.
We should stop worrying about the statistics,
Yep.
at least for a while. What is the lesson of this into a situation where we then enter into debates about it hasn't happened yet, and we're talking about probabilities, and we're talking about computer-based models and statistical run of very complex things?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and so I should say that one of the arguments for the Mechanista view is one that I didn't mention, which is that in many domains of highly successful science, we're willing to make inferences based on theoretical or mechanistic reasoning independent of, say, statistics or population level experiments. I mean, astronomy, cosmology, the geosciences, all sorts of sciences in which modeling it plays a prominent role. And so the Mechanista says, well, it's kind of strange that when it comes to evidence-based medicine and evidence-based policy, the key thinkers dismiss that kind of reasoning. So, for instance, Galileo made his inferences based on appeal to theoretical principles, or the future prediction of the observation of particular planets, say, was made by appealing to pure theory, and so and then those are typically borne out, right? And so highly successful sciences operate on what broadly construed could be taken to be like Mechanista principles. And so then what about these kind of more complicated cases that are important today, like climate modeling and predictions about future climate states? I guess generally, given that I'm persuaded by a kind of modest Mechanista position, I'm perfectly willing to accept what the best science says about future states based on theoretical or mechanistic reasoning. There's a soft spot in my heart for the statisticalista worry that when it comes to very complicated causal states, that inferences based on mechanistic reasoning we ought to be at least humble about the kinds of inferences we can make. But I think it goes too far to say that, well, we can never make reliable inferences based on mechanistic principles. Yeah. But thanks for your question. Yeah.
You said you had a few loaded questions.
No, I said it's probably too loaded, but that's
too loaded.
yes.
Okay. Thanks. So Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. It's fantastic to actually get such a careful and rigorous explication of these kind of issues, because in the kind of policy worlds where I work, there is as you probably be aware, because you're based in Britain, there's this sort of tremendous push towards only randomised controlled trials are valuable, and that includes things like education policy, where kind of huge tradition of very, very careful research in education is being supplanted by the idea that you can can work out how to educate kids best by randomised control trials. And, perhaps because I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist, but I wonder if I can draw you out of your particular area a little bit to think about where that impetus towards this comes from. I mean, I kind of think that, well, I've got three kind of ideas. One is that government kind of tends to like hard data. It doesn't like, I think it was Truman who said he wanted a one-handed scientist, So there's a sense of, oh, the statistics show this, therefore it's indisputable. So there's a government sort of funding push towards this kind of stuff. Another is that some of the people who are pushing things, particularly big pharma, like randomised control trials because it's so much easier to manipulate the outcome that's preferable. There's plenty of cases of them hiding data around particular drugs that they don't like. And the other is perhaps it's something that perhaps researchers themselves are complicit in, because in the terrible drive towards kind of impact and being believed, there's a tendency to go towards these kinds of methods because your career depends upon having impact and getting your stuff accepted. So you use these kinds of methods because everybody else kind of buys into them. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that, really.
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot there, and I sympathize with a lot of what's there. Okay, so yeah, in my heart, I'm a conspiracy theorist. So I think you're onto something. This historian of science, Ted Porter, has this book called Trust in Numbers, and I think that it's a pretty punchy title. The idea is that if we can just quantify things, then the number that comes out of that quantification is something that we can trust, right? We can trust as citizens, as policymakers, as consumers of scientific products. And so just having a number, so that's why like the results of a randomized control trial or a meta-analysis can just seem so persuasive because there's a number, right? And you mentioned that, big pharma might have an incentive to really promulgate the role of randomized control trials precisely because they're manipulable. And I think that's one reason, or historically it's been one reason. And a second reason is that there's only certain kinds of medical interventions that you can do a double-blinded, controlled, randomized trial on. And the easiest kind of intervention is a pharmaceutical. It's a lot harder to do an intervention on, say, like a randomized control trial on, say, yeah, exactly. The effect of social dance on blood pressure, right, or on the progression of Alzheimer's disease, or something like that. Yeah, and so it really suits the interest. Now, what's interesting is that from the time that RCTs first developed until about 5 years ago or so, maybe 10 years ago, Big Pharma really they got into the RCT. They promoted and supported the importance of RCTs, and I think that this was an era in which RCTs were manipulable. In the last 10 or 15 years, a lot of epidemiologists and policymakers and sort of like, social critics of medical science have served to raise the epistemic standards for RCTs. So there's all sorts of like checks in place now that make it a lot harder to manipulate the results of RCTs. And one thing that's interesting is that there's now what some people are calling an effect size crisis, which is that the measured effect size of tested pharmaceuticals in the last 15 or 20 years has plummeted like almost to zero on average. So there are really interesting sort of second order studies that show that when really careful methodological safeguards were put into place in particular clinical domains, the effect sizes of RCTs just went way down. Now, Big Pharma, I think, is thinking, well, actually, with these really rigorous RCTs, we don't want to be part of this business anymore because our drugs don't look so good. So there's a big push now to get away from the RCT standard. And this is tied up with the movement in the so-called personalized medicine movement. So some people say, with personalized medicine, orphan diseases, diseases for which there's only a few people in the world that have this particular subclass of a particular disease. We can't do big RCTs anymore because there's just not enough subjects to do them, but we can reason mechanistically because we've been doing more and more basic science. And so we should get away from the RCT standard and go towards a more kind of Mechanista standard. And although, you know, I was defending a modest Mechanista position here, the reason why I think my position is modest is that I still think that, with Samuelian thinking, I think that RCTs are still play a really important role in causal inference. So they're necessary but not sufficient for the kinds of inferences that we want to make. And it's really dangerous, and this is the conspiracy theorist in me talking, it's really dangerous for us to be entertaining the possibility of regulatory regimes getting away from the RCT standard precisely because we've made the bar so high to meet. If we get rid of that bar and we go towards a kind of looser approach that just involves a highly subjective appeal to mechanisms, then I think that opens up the door again for manipulation. So I think we ought to have these two kinds of evidence in place. Yeah, really rigorous statistical evidence plus appealing to mechanisms. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, thanks for the wonderful talk. It was very beautiful how you linked the debate to this Bayesian view. So I was just, this kind of follow-up on this certain type of distrust in numbers, to put it this way. For some, the Bayesian framework smacks as over-precise with all the decimals and so on.
Yep.
What would your sort of view be on that?
Yeah, I really like this question a lot because that's my own view about the apparatus. So one worry about using this kind of formalism is that it gives this kind of sheen, this kind of false sheen of objective rigor that we can really quantify all these terms extremely precisely. And I actually don't think that that's the case. I think that in real science, these terms are much more ambiguous and pretty subjective. Now, that said, the argument, like all of the kind of articulation of the four arguments involved appealing to terms, involved requiring that the terms be middling or extremal. Yeah, really coarse-grained assessments of the terms in the Bayesian apparatus. So, you know, the arguments don't require that this hypothesis be, you know, the prior be 0.457 or something like that. No, it's just extremal or middling. Of course, one could ask, well, how extremal does extremal have to be in order for the argument to apply? But I think that's a kind of, you know, that's a kind of line drawing problem that I'm not too fussed about. So yeah, in general, I share your worry, and then I think the thing to point out about this particular paper is that it only requires like really coarse-grained assessments of the terms. Yeah, thanks.
I think it's time to what? It's more or less time to thank all the participants, and many thanks to Jacob.